Afghanistan, Iraq, and Kosovo, and other places. And after 27 years of that, I decided that I needed a little change. So I went to the University of Maryland and took their programs to become a master gardener and a master naturalist. And for the last 2.5 years, I've been president of Southern Maryland Audubon. And for folks that may be new to us, we do all sorts of programs. We obviously do bird walks and talks all across Southern Maryland. We also do monthly programming like this. We hold workshops at local libraries and other places on birds and native plants and other issues. We sponsor scholarships to Audubon's Hog Island Nature Camp in Maine. We also get involved in advocacy, advocating for laws that protect birds and the environment in the Maryland legislature and the US Congress. You can also see on the picture here, we put up owl boxes as part of our grassland and raptors conservation programs. So any of you would like to get involved in any of our programs, we always welcome you. So many of you have seen this statistic before, that so many birds are in decline and could lose their habitats by 2080 here. And that includes the Baltimore Oriole, which possibly could no longer be breeding in Maryland. The wood thrush, which is the state bird of Washington, D.C., and the scarlet tanagers, which are losing forests that they need they require large territories to raise their young. And also 40% of insect species are threatened with extinction. So with that combination, what can you do? Well, actually, you can turn your yard into a safe refuge for birds and other wildlife. And it's a lot easier than you might think. So what do all these babies need? They need insects. 96% of all terrestrial birds in North America need insects to feed their young. And Douglas Tallamy, who some of you are gardeners and master naturalists may have heard of, he's sort of the god to the nature plant world, did a research in the Washington suburbs, actually, where he had his research assistants, his graduate students, put a camera on a Carolina chickadee nest to see how many insects and caterpillars it would take that chickadee or the chickadee parents to raise their family. And the answer was 7,500 to 9,000, one family of chickadees. So here you can see that insects are overwhelmingly the food that birds need. And the best way to attract insects to your yard is to go native. The native plants are part of the balance of nature. They co-evolved with native birds and insects and other wildlife in a particular region or ecosystem over hundreds of thousands of years. So this is one of the critical problems today, is that 43% of the US is now developed as suburban or urban areas. I mean, this picture could have been made around La Plata or Waldorf or Leonardtown or Lexington Park. And as you see, when they rip down the forest and put in these new subdivisions, most of the plants tend to be about 80% non-native. So you look at a yard like this, and I hope this is not one of your yards, but there's obviously no room and board for birds here. And there's not a native plant in sight in either of these yards, and huge amounts of lawn. And you can see that all the water is taking in the background of the one picture for irrigation. So natives are a big part of the solution. They provide the essential food and shelter for local birds and pollinators and other wildlife. They're better suited for our climate, and they can even adapt with climate change better than other plants. Once you establish them, they require a lot less water. They don't need fertilizer. A lot of people say, oh, my soil is this crummy Southern Maryland clay, but we have tons of natives that are perfectly happy in our Southern Maryland clay. They tolerate just this variety of soil and light conditions. There's no matter what kind of soil you have in your yard or area that you're planting, there's going to be plenty of natives for you to choose from. Same thing, there's plenty of shade natives, sunlight natives, and natives that like partial shade and sun. They add year-round beauty and interest to the garden, and that's what we're going to talk about more tonight, is the interest in the winter. They're healthier for you in the environment. And here's one example. One of the best trees you can plant in your yard, if you have room, is an oak tree. An oak tree like our white oaks and others will support 537 species of caterpillars. So the ginkgo tree, which people love because it has the reputation of being one of the oldest trees on the planet, although it's not native to our region, supports 4 species of caterpillars. So you're going to have way fewer birds. And I've seen this from experience. When I worked in downtown Washington, there was a ginkgo tree right outside my office window, and I hardly ever saw birds or any insects around that tree. These are some great, easy to grow natives that anybody can grow in almost any conditions in your yard. And the bee balm, the monardas, are not liked by deer and rabbits and others, so it's a great one to plant. The mist plant, the common sneezeweed, the goldenrod are all not tasty to the animals that like to visit us. One thing on the sneezeweed, it does not make you sneeze. It got that name from Native Americans who would dry the seed heads and essentially use it as snuff to force themselves to sneeze. But if you have it growing in your garden, it's not going to make you sneeze. And another myth with the goldenrod, it will also not make you sneeze and give you allergies. It gets a bad rap because in the wild, it grows with ragweed, which is the culprit that's making you sneeze and is affecting your allergies. The goldenrod is not pollinated by the wind, it's pollinated by insects. So there's no pollen that can be attacking you. These are some other great natives that are easy to grow. The coneflowers, asters, which you might see blooming now, both in gardens and in the wild. There's all different colors of asters now blooming along the roadsides and in the forest areas where you can go walking in the fields in southern Maryland now. Foxglove beard tongue, milkweed obviously is great for monarch butterflies and other butterflies. And the little partridge pea is a great native plant. The great things about natives is they fit any space. There's a picture here. If any of you have been to the Leonardtown Library, to their front yard garden, they have developed a fabulous native garden in front of the library. We are creating a large native garden at Lexington Manor Passive Park in Lexington Park through a grant that National Audubon Society gave us early this year. The high school students from Forest, Career, and Tech in Leonardtown have taken it on as their class project this year because they're learning all about natives, and they have been coming out helping prep the beds and doing a lot of the heavy lifting and labor. And next week we'll be planting out the first bed with natives. Many of those natives were donated to us by the Elms Environmental Education Center in St. Mary's, which has been forced to close its greenhouse, and they donated several hundred plants to us that were all grown by St. Mary's 7th grade students in the last couple of years. You can also, if you live in an apartment building, you can talk to the managers about just developing a small little area for native plants, maybe near your building or in another area. If you don't have a yard, if you're in an apartment, you can grow natives in container gardens. And they're also great in little small city and urban patio gardens or a townhouse garden that you might have. And so when you start out, keep it manageable. Start small. Maybe just take one little area of your yard and decide that you're going to convert it into natives and plant, 1 or 2 or 3 varieties of natives there and just create that little bird and insect oasis. Also, here's another one. This is cardinal flowers, just this one little garden area that was perfectly suited to cardinal flowers at like a wet space. There was always, the soil here was kind of damp. And so I started growing cardinal flowers there and they loved it. So one of the other things you're hearing lots about now is to reduce your lawn. And again, you don't need to go out and like plow up your whole lawn and plant natives. You can reduce it a little bit by bit. And you want to mimic the natural habitats and plant flowers and shrubs and trees. You can see here just this yard, they just took just a little small area and planted black-eyed Susans. You want to avoid overly tidy gardens and borders. You want to not just clean up every dead leaf that falls and every dead stem and have this sort of, what some would consider this picture perfect garden, because you're taking away the habitat from the insects and the birds. It's that complexity that attracts birds and other wildlife to your yard. Or say you're already a gardener. You can tackle larger areas and stages, and it's perfectly fine to fill in, like you see in this picture, other plants like zinnias, which the bees love, and which will fill in some of your blank space while you're waiting for your natives to start filling out. So fall is the perfect time to start creating a new native plant bed. And this is one of the methods that we recommend. It's the method we're using at the Lexington Manor Passive Park Garden. So stake out the area where you want your bed and lay down cardboard. Probably just a couple of months of collecting cardboard from your Amazon and other deliveries will give you enough. Kind of one word of caution here: if you have any tape or staples on them, you want to take them off, because that's not good for the health of the soil. And you don't want to use any cardboard that has a big sort of plastic pre-printing, colored printing on the sides of it, because the any potential toxic chemicals from that can leach into the soil. So after you've laid down the cardboard, and a lot of times people water it to kind of make it hew to the ground a little bit better, then start piling on your organic matter, your mulch and compost, old leaves, pine straw, any kind of straw that has not been treated with pesticides in an agricultural field. And it's almost impossible to pile on too much. You can put in as much as you want, and then rake it over. So two things: you could do this now and put in some plants for this winter, or an even better option would be to make your beds now and just let them rest over the winter, and they will be perfectly ready for planting in the spring. One word of caution on that: you want to be sure that you put a blanket of leaves or mulch or pine straw on top, and not leave your compost or your soil bare, because too many of the good nutrients will wash out off over the winter. So make sure you give your bed a nice little blanket. So natives, when you first plant them, we say they sleep. So if you plant them right now, they're going to look like this. And they'll look like this when they come up at the beginning of spring next year. And then the second year, they creep. So you may not get a huge full bloom in that second year, although some plants do quite well in the second year. But you'll see them starting to spread. And what's happening in that year that they're sleeping, it's not that they're just sitting there doing nothing. They are sending down their amazing root system, which is another reason that native plants are so great for the soil and for your yard. But then I'll show you this garden in the third year. These black-eyed Susans just took off and completely filled in the area. And then after the third year, I was digging up little plants, giving them away to folks. So you take a look at how these are planted in this first picture. You want to plant densely when you plant native plants. And you can see those plants are about a foot apart. And that's how you want to plant native plants. And you'll get a beautiful filled out garden like this, in your third and fourth years. But the reason you want to plant them so close together is to crowd out the weeds. Because the idea with native plants is, after the first couple of years, you don't need to bother with mulching around them. They will shade out those weeds and other things that are trying to come out there. And in an established native garden, you can often get away with pretty sparse weeding over the years. And you'll of course want to choose how you place your natives, just like any other plants. You want to put the taller ones in the back and the shorter ones in the front. You can see here the blue mist really complements the orange coneflowers that are growing behind them. And then if you keep going behind the orange coneflowers are the Joe Pye weeds, which can get really tall. So one trick on a lot of people don't like natives because they look messy and they get so tall in the garden. You can, in June or so, give almost all of these tall growing natives what's become known as the Chelsea chop, because it happens kind of around the time of the Chelsea Garden Show in London. You can cut about a third of the plants off, and they will actually have more flowers. They may bloom a little bit later. One trick that you can do is, say, looking at these Joe Pye here, you could go in with your pruners and maybe clip a third of them, a third way down, and maybe another third halfway down. And so you'll get the flowers blooming at multiple levels instead of just one level. And it won't hurt the plants at all. I first discovered this trick from my deer. One year they came in and mowed through the Joe Pye weed, whacking them all down to about half their height. And when they bloomed later that summer, they had never been more pretty. The other thing you want to do is plant in as many layers as you can. So you see here in the back, there's a Sweet Bay magnolia tree, which is our native magnolia. And then beneath that, you can have shrubs like this native inkberry. Over here, you can see, which is finished blooming, is the wild bergamot, and then some New York ironweed and cardinal flowers. So you get a nice layering of plants because different insects like to use plants at different levels, and birds like to use plants at different levels. You'll see a robin will build its nest at a different level than a northern cardinal, than these little ruby-throated hummingbirds here. So the more you plant in layers, the more variety you're going to be able to give to the birds that will come to your garden. And these are some of my favorite native trees, which are fabulous. The eastern red cedar, which of course you see everywhere, is great for all types of birds in the winter, not just the cedar waxwings. The Sweet Bay magnolia has beautiful fragrant flowers on it in the spring, and then these beautiful red berries. And I took this picture last year. It's a red-eyed vireo. And I sat in my garden every morning drinking tea. And for a week, every morning, this red-eyed vireo came and just chowed down on the seeds in this Sweet Bay magnolia tree. And meanwhile, I had next to it a fringe tree where you see this mockingbird. And this mockingbird and his family descended on this fringe tree and ate every one of those berries over the course of a week. So it was this fabulous natural bird feeder that was going on right in front of me. So everybody loves hummingbirds, and you can, of course, put out the feed for them. But if you plant for the hummingbirds, you're going to see that they go to the native flowers first. And you can start with the wild columbine, which blooms around here in April, sometimes even early March, and into May, when our hummingbirds our migrants are coming through and our local residents are coming back to us. And then the bee balm blooms about a month or so after that, while the hummingbirds need reserves to start building their nest and looking for insects for their young. And then the cardinal flower blooms in late summer, and you'll see hummingbirds just absolutely love the cardinal flowers. Now, if you want to attract them all through the summer, there's nothing better than our native coral honeysuckle, which here can bloom for sometimes 3/4 of the year once your plants are established. They're just a super hummingbird plant. So let's go into winter. If you look at this, if you're a bird, what do you think this is? So this person has gotten their yard ready for winter. They've pulled up all the weeds. They've cut everything down to the ground. And if I'm a bird flying through, this is just an absolute food desert to me. There is nothing here to attract birds. There's nothing to provide cover for insects. So there's very little for the birds to eat. So I think it's time to rethink winter in gardening and how we look at our gardens in winter and leading up to winter. The first thing that we suggest is in the fall, skip the chores. Go out kayaking, look at the leaves, read a book, go out running, go out, do whatever you want to do, but skip a lot of those fall chores. This picture was taken on the Waikamaca River. So the fall prep for your garden. Don't bag the leaves, don't blow the leaves, and don't cut the dead flower stalks and grasses. And we're going to talk about why. So you want to leave the leaves to make your yard more sustainable. It improves the soil, of course. It reduces the need for fertilizer as they break down. It reduces water pollution. It helps hold the water into the ground. It protects your plants from drought in the winter and from flooding. And it costs nothing. It's free mulch. And even for folks who love their lawns, like my husband, you can let leaves collect on your lawn and they're actually going to benefit the lawn. Now, of course, if you have like a sycamore tree or something like that, that's dumping just tons and tons of leaves across your lawn, it's totally fine to rake them and but use them in your flower beds. They're absolute great fertilizer. So leaves are winter's best blanket. They provide the shelter for beneficial insects. They provide food and shelter for birds and small animals and turtles and frogs. So we like to say, don't blow their cover. Leave it on for the winter. So let's talk about some winter bird buffets and beneficial insect hotels. These are all winter plants. And one of the things that it's great to do when you pick out which plants you want for your native gardens and for your yard, think about what they might look like in the wintertime. So you have this clustered mountain mint, which is beautiful, and the leaves are very fragrant in the summertime, and in the late summer, their flowers are fairly short-lived, but they are a total magnet for all kinds of pollinators. But in the winter, if you don't cut them down, the leaves fall off and you have these nice seed heads that look beautiful when the sun hits them, and you'll see all types of birds picking at them and eating them. The same thing with the goldenrod. It's beautiful in the fall. You're seeing it blooming everywhere right now. If you don't cut it down, you're going to get these great seed heads that turn a beautiful golden brown, and they're just so much prettier to look at in the winter than if you'd cut everything down to the ground. And plus, we're going to talk about what's living in them. Or look at this switchgrass. And a lot of people in the fall, as soon as the native grasses start dying, they go out there and they hack them down, and they want, you see just like this little puff ball of grass, and people think that looks really tidy. But look at this that was left on here. Every afternoon the sun would hit it, and you would just have this bright flash of gold. So the seed heads are, of course, a smorgasbord for birds. You'll see the birds clustering around them in the winter. Look at which types of birds are eating which seeds. And so it sort of raises the question, is there a need to feed? And the truth of the matter is, if you've planted a lot of natives in your yard, and if you've left those seed heads standing and left those stalks standing, in our climate, there's not a huge need for the birds to feed them in the winter. But we love watching the birds at the feeders. And so the feeders give us joy. They tell, we learn a lot about birds by watching them. So this is not at all a call to say, stop feeding birds at bird feeders in the winter. It's just to note that you're probably putting out the feeders more for yourself actually than the birds. And that's, of course, not to say they're not going to flock to it, because it's easy pickings. And they don't have to go foraging under your leaves and your trees. So of course that may be one of the things they eat. Although, as you've noticed earlier this fall, we had lots of folks writing into us and saying, oh, birds are just not going to my feeders. And it's because at this time of year, there's so many natural seeds and plants for them to eat that they're going to go for those first. So the other important factor is to take a look at who's living under your leaves. There are so many of our insects that require the duff, which is called in the forest, to survive through the winter. And that's including lightning bugs. If you want fireflies in your yard, you have to leave your leaves on the ground because the fireflies, the little glowworms, grow under that leaf cover. So folks who've completely blown their yards clean and raked every leaf out of the yard and put it in the bag on the curb are not going to have many fireflies in their yard. Also, leaving these materials provide year-round shelter for birds and for other wildlife. One thing that's really handy to do is just create a little brush pile in the corner of your yard that's kind of out of sight. This one's pretty large. These people, there's probably lots of happy insects and birds and small critters in there. You don't have to make one that large, but just find some little place in your yard or the edge of your patio where you can pile your branches and things that fall out of the trees, and it'll provide a nice little native shelter for the birds. So here we go. Let's look. This is sort of a typical suburban yard area. And which way you think is the best bird B&B here? You have on the one side this nice little iron fence, and these people have just tended their yard to perfection, and they've cut down every brown branch, and there's not a leaf to be seen. Well, there's a couple of leaves to be seen. But this is just not going to be very enticing to either migrating birds or the resident birds that are going to be coming to this area. But right down the street, you see this yard. And they've left the vines on the fences. They've left the plants and the bushes along the fence line. And in the wintertime, this yard on both sides of the fences are just alive with all sorts of birds, and there's all sorts of insects that are burrowed down in there that are reproducing, waiting for the spring to come out. So let's take a look at like a perfect winter wildlife retreat. And we talked about earlier planting your plants in layers. So here you go. Here's the Sweet Bay magnolia, and all through the winter, the birds rest on this tree. So one of the great things about the Sweet Bay magnolia is it is a deciduous tree, which means it drops its leaves. However, a lot of times, especially with our increasingly mild winters, about a third of the leaves will stay on the tree all through the winter, and they turn a beautiful golden color. So you have not only a pretty tree, but a really nice place for birds to rest and recuperate during the winter. Then a little bit lower, you have the inkberry. And in the wintertime, birds love to hang out in the inkberry, especially little white-throated sparrows and Carolina wrens. And they'll pick off any of the berries that have been missed by other birds in the fall. And again, I mentioned, there's no sin in planting non-natives. Anything that's not invasive is totally fine. And zinnias are, of course, loved by birds, and their stems are great for nesting insects. And here the mountain mint and the anise hyssop and the sage were all left. And again, seed heads there, birds all winter are pecking at those seed heads. And the switchgrass was left standing with the seed heads for the birds and plenty of stalks for insects. Plus, clumps were providing shelter for birds all through the winter. So by leaving a lot of this standing, you're not only creating habitat for birds and insects, but you're creating beauty. It's just so much nicer to walk out into your yard or on your patio on a sunny winter day and see the sun reflecting off of these seed heads and grasses and interesting barks. This is a river birch, native river birch tree. Than if you just stripped everything and you're just kind of looking at bare earth out there all winter. One thing that is essential for birds in the wintertime is water. And of course, they want to you need to give them the water to drink and to bathe. But the other really critical thing in the wintertime is the fluff. You've noticed how birds all fluff out, especially on cold days, and they look really fat. Well, that's their winter coat. And the way they stay warm in the winter is by allowing air into all the little spaces between their feathers. So it's really important for them to keep those feathers clean, especially in the winter. And it's not going to bother them. The cold water is not going to bother them, because it's really important to them in the winter to keep their feathers clean so that they can stay dry and warm. So we can't really talk about attracting more birds to your yard without talking about how to not make your yard a death trap for birds. And there's really a lot of unintended death traps out there. So if you are providing all these native plants for birds and you've got them coming in, eating the seed heads and going for the insects that are living in the stalks and on the ground, they can smash into your windows. And during the migration season, an increasing problem is lights, which disrupt their migrating patterns and can disorient birds, not only when they're flying over large cities, but I'm sure many of you in Southern Maryland have noticed that more and more people, especially in the rural areas, are putting up these huge so-called safety or security lights in their yards. And this is also really dangerous and disorienting for birds and insects. And of course, cats. So we love cats. I've most of my life had cats, but it's much healthier for your cats and the birds to keep your cats inside. So you can see that an estimated billion birds die in window collisions every year. These birds are some that have been collected by museums to kind of chronicle what's happening to the birds. And you might think of the collisions as happening only in the big high rises, like, excuse me, in Washington or the suburbs, or a big glass building in Baltimore, but they happen everywhere, and they happen at all times of the day. In fact, 44% of all the bird collisions happen in residences on the first 1 to 3 stories. More than half happen in low-rise buildings, like 4 to 11 stories, like the buildings you see all along our highways. And only 1% actually of birds are killed by high-rise buildings. It's really easy to fix your windows. One of the ways are these Ecopian bird savers. You can just order off of Amazon. They're basically parachute string, and you can order them in whatever size window you have. They're really easy to put up. And once you put them up, we have them on windows in our house that were real bird killers. You don't even really see them anymore. They don't bother you. You can still, shoot photos through them and, catch the birds and the wildlife in your yard. So these are really easy. You can also do the feather-friendly dots. And again, from the inside, you kind of quit seeing them after they've been up a day or two, and the birds can see them. So if you put up the dots, you really want to keep the dots within 4 inches of each other. That's the range at which it's been determined that a bird knows it cannot get through. And you can see the problem here on these windows. The birds see these reflections and they think they're flying into trees, or they're flying towards the water that may be reflected from a pond or a river in your windows.
Audubon, Southern Audubon.
And then, so 70% of birds migrate at night, and they use a whole number of cues to find their way, including the Earth's magnetic field and the position of the stars and the moon. And as I mentioned before, this can be hugely disorienting to migrating birds. So you've seen increasingly in large cities, especially on the East Coast, there's lots of lights out programs for birds, but you can also just do this at your own home. You can reduce the amount and intensity of the lighting. One of the best things you can do for migration season, and we're still in migration season now, is turn off your exterior lights between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. That's the peak of the migration at night in April and May and September and October, where we are now. And also, again, keep your kitties indoors. It's safer for the birds and it's safer for your pet. Also, this is a big battle. I'm sure a lot of you fight with some of your neighbors. Pesticides not only kill mosquitoes, and sometimes most of the times they don't even do that because they're not sprayed properly, but they kill all the beneficial insects that the birds need to survive. So if you have no insects, you're going to have no birds. So I'm happy to open up to questions that any of you might have. Thanks so much for joining. And I'm going to stop the screen share here. And if folks have any questions, you can just kind of unmute yourself and ask.
Molly, I have a question. I am a proponent of leaving the leaves in our yard. And then my husband would like to have them out in the spring. And so I am curious, what is a good time to kind of figure that out we have a very small lawn. Most of it is, we are working towards natives, but we do have a little bit in the back that he likes to tend to. And we leave the leaves. So what is your recommendation for?
So it's great if he'll allow you to leave them all through the winter, and you could rate them, in the spring around the March time frame when you're starting to plant, and like I said, instead of like bagging them to throw away, put them around your gardens to use for free fertilizer. And this sort of raises another question that a lot of people have too. Is when can you cut down your stems and your grasses? And again, we recommend that you wait until sometime in March, because by then most of the insects that would have been hibernating in them, the little solitary bees and other insects, they will have come out. And you do want to cut them before the birds start nesting, so that you don't wait too late and whack bird nests and whack birds when you're cutting down your grasses and other things. So does that answer your question?
Yeah. So like mid-March, you think?
Yeah, that's kind of perfect timing.
Super. Thank you.
Sure. And there's a question in the chat box about what happens to switchgrass that has died over the winter when spring comes. Well, so same thing for the switchgrass. You can go out in mid-March roughly and use shears or whatever you use and cut it down about a foot or so from the ground. If you see, if we have a really warm winter and you already see little green shoots coming up, be sure that you cut above them. And again, you can use the grasses for fertilizer or natural mulch around trees, around plants, anything in your yard, as opposed to, or putting it in a brush pile for birds, as opposed to throwing it away. So someone has asked, is it possible to cut the stems and leave them on the ground over the winter for the insects? I have tons of late boneset in my front yard. So one thing you can do, if you're just really bothered by the taller native plants, is you can cut them down to a half or 1/3 their size and leave those stems. And now would be a good time to start doing that if you're going to do it. Leave a good half or third of those stems standing, and the insects can still get in there and overwinter. And then in March, you can come down and cut them closer to the ground when the young shoots are getting ready to come up. What's the last safe date to plant new plugs in the fall? So right now is a great time. Basically, the last safe date is the first frost. You want to get them in the ground before the first frost. And usually you can't predict an exact date by that, but generally you can plant here until towards the end of November, unless we get a really unusual cold snap. And the main problem of once you get it cold is the ground freezes, and it's really hard to plant in the ground. It's not necessarily going to hurt the natives that you've put in. But right now, with the rain and the warm weather, if you put in the plugs now, the roots will start spreading out into the soil, and they'll start building up before that first frost comes. So anytime between now and mid to toward the end of November here would be a good time to plant plugs, and any other native plants, actually.
Could you please?
A question here, should you cut the native plants back in the fall, in the winter or spring? The optimum time would be the spring, in the March time frame, because at that point, the native insects have climbed out, but also you've left them there all winter for both the migrating birds as they pass through in the fall and the spring, but also importantly for the resident birds. And it's a lot of fun leaving these in your yard. You'll be amazed at how many birds you'll see just flitting around in those dead bushes all through the winter. Somebody asked, what about the deer? Yeah, the deer are a huge problem. One of the things you can do is, a lot of plants that say they're deer resistant, there's really no such thing for a couple of reasons. One, deer are like us, they change their appetites. And also in the spring, when the little fawns are out, they really haven't fully figured out their taste buds. And they'll come along and nibble almost anything. And they may find that it's not tasty and they never go back, but that's after they've decimated all your little plants that are coming up. But in general, they don't like any kind of mints or Monardas, or are fairly deer resistant, mostly because they don't taste very good. Another great plant that it's kind of hard to find in plant stores, but you can easily order seeds and grow them yourself, is the white snake root. And it's actually poisonous to deer, but it will not be like poisonous to your dog or cat unless they dig them up and just gnaw on the roots, and it won't kill them. It'll just make them pretty sick. But they have beautiful white flowers, and they bloom from late summer into fall. And one of the great things about them is they will bloom and grow in the deepest shade. So they're really a little known native that are really great in our area. Let me check out other questions here. Where is a good place to purchase native plants? That's a great question. So one, a great place is Chesapeake Natives in Prince George's County. They're a nonprofit organization, and they sell only natives from this area. There's also a great place in Hollywood, right near Leonardtown, called Butterfly Alley. They are only open for a couple of weeks in spring and fall, and they sell plugs, which are really, really cost effective. And your plants will grow almost as fast as a larger plant. If you plant plugs by the end of the first year, they're going to be the same size as some big plant that you went and paid, $15 for at a big box store, if you could find a native plant at a big box store. But they post their list several weeks, or actually several months before they open, and so you can order them, and then when they're ready from their wholesalers, they send out a notice in the usually for a couple of dates in spring and a couple of dates in fall, that you can go and pick them up. The other thing you can do, and we're going to be having several workshops at different places this fall, is it's incredibly easy to grow your own natives using a technique called winter sowing, where you plant the seeds in milk jugs and then just put them out in your yard or on your patio or on your deck for the winter, and kind of monitor them if it's dry, not let them dry out too much, but usually just the precipitation we get in the winter is plenty, and you'll have a milk jug full of little seedlings in the spring, and it will not have cost you very much. And so, like I said, we're going to hold several workshops on how to do this, because it's really easy, and it's a really, really economical way to to grow your own natives, and also to grow natives that you can't find even in the native stores. One thing you want to be cautious of in the big box stores, a lot of them are saying they're starting to sell natives now, but they're really selling cultivars of natives. And that means it's a native plant that, oh, well, they wanted the red to be a little redder, or they wanted the stems to be bushier. So they have propagated them to meet these different kind of requirements. Well, the problem is that hasn't developed with our native insects and birds, and so they're not nearly as beneficial to birds and insects. And you can tell a cultivar because they usually have a cute little name attached to them, like standing ovation, little blue stem grass, or something like that. So anything that's been given a cutesy name, that's usually the tip off that it's a cultivar and not what we call a straight native. Oh, and somebody noted, yes, Butterfly Alley in Leonardtown is having a sale this weekend. The emerald green arborvitaes, a native or at least non-invasive as a border tree. It's not a native. They're not invasive, but also they're not as resistant to insects and pests and diseases as our native red cedar, which I think is just as beautiful, maybe more so. They're not invasive to plant, but and especially when you're planting them in a long row like that, if one of them gets a disease, or if one of them gets a certain kind of different insect infestations, it can knock out your whole row. So if you're interested in planting rows of trees, either for privacy or windbreak or whatever, it's highly recommended that you plant different kinds of trees, so that if one gets taken out by a disease, it doesn't quickly spread all down your row and take out all your trees. And that kind of goes for shrubs as well. Someone is recommending checking out the Maryland Native Plant Society website. They have lists and maps of native plant nurseries. The other thing is there are a lot of plant nurseries that have sales in spring and fall that maybe aren't necessarily open year round. Also, a lot of local master gardeners and master naturalists and garden clubs have sales and are putting them on now. Bonatera, up, I think in Montgomery County, does plant giveaways and sales. So you might just Google for at also the Native Plant Society website, and also Googling for your particular area to see if there are any sales going on currently. Okay, some shout out to Butterfly Alley. The place is gorgeous. Carrie takes time to talk to you about the plants, and the plants are really healthy, and that is really true. She's created a beautiful demonstration garden in front of the little house and greenhouse where they sell the plants, and you can walk around and see what the plants are going to look like in a couple of 3 years, which one of them behave and which misbehave. And she's great. She's just a font of knowledge, and she'll talk to you as long as you like and answer all your questions. So yes, she's getting a lot of kudos here in the chat box. Well deserved. Oh yeah, Chesapeake Natives. I'm sorry. Yes, Upper Marlboro. Someone else is recommending Pope Farm Nursery in Gaithersburg. And there is a native plant swap October 19th at the Leonardtown Library. There's also a Maryland Native Gardening group on Facebook, and people post about sales and events. So all these are great tips. Thank you all for sending them in. Let me see if there's any questions I've missed here. Does anybody else have any questions we haven't talked about?
Hi, Molly. I actually had 2 questions as a newbie. One of them has to do with prepping the space. You were showing in some slides earlier how they were laying down the cardboard and then the compost and the leaves. Did you do anything before the cardboard as far as prepping soil, or just leave it?
Great question, great question. I should have mentioned, yes, what you want to do if you're doing it over grass, you want to cut the grass as close to the ground as you possibly can before you lay the cardboard. So one of the reasons that we recommend the cardboard as opposed to going out with a hoe or a tiller and tilling up the grass is when you do that, you're actually pulling up years of weed seeds. To this, any disturbance of the soil will help these weeds regenerate. And so that's one of the reasons that the cardboard is great, because you can just cut the grasses really low, lay the cardboard, and be sure and put all the compost on top of it. So there, in some gardening circles, the cardboard is controversial because you know, when you're first putting it down, it is kind of disrupting the microbes in the soil. But what I found is over a very short time, the cardboard starts disintegrating. And in fact, you know, it attracts up, for some reason, the earthworms seem to love the cardboard, and it really attracts them, and they start breaking up the soil, especially if you're planting your bed in an area that was sort of a problem area with hard soil. And you had another question.
I did, yes. Thank you for that. That was super informative. The other question I had is I live in a really high shade area. I was wondering if you had any recommendations for plants that do really well in the shade, but also attract a lot of birds and insects.
But also, I'm sorry, I missed the second part.
Attract lots of birds and insects.
So yeah, so the snake root, the white snake root that I mentioned grows great in deep shade. Also, we have tons of native ferns, and they are great for attracting native insects, and you know, turtles and frogs burrow down in them, and some of them like moist soil and some like dry soil. Other plants in the fall, in the winter, there are different ground covers like golden ragwort, which has beautiful spikes of yellow flowers, and it can handle very deep shade. One of a great resource is the Chesapeake Bay Alliance has put online this amazing resource that U.S. Wildlife and Fisheries created of all the native plants for our region. And you can go in and check whether you want a shade plant, a sunny plant, a part shade plant, what time of year you want them to bloom, what kind of soil you have. You can click all the boxes for these parameters, and they'll send you, it'll send you up a list of native plants for that particular your particular situation. And it's one that I use all the time to double check plants, whether they would work in the conditions I have. Oh, great, Laura, thank you. Just put the allianceforthebay.org website up in the chat box, and that is probably one of the best resources for this particular area.
Perfect, thank you.
Sure.
Molly, that was really great. I appreciate you stepping up at the last minute to replace Scott with his dire emergencies down there that we got left short, you know, a little end of rush there at the end. But this was very informative, and I enjoyed it immensely. I think everybody did.
Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for joining. I really, really appreciate it. And, you know, our thoughts are obviously with Scott and his family, because, you know, it's such a tragedy that he's enduring there. So I was really happy that, I could jump in pretty quickly and let us still have a program tonight. And if y'all might want to check the chat box, folks are adding Herring Run Nursery. And also that Bonatera, yes, is moving to the Indian Head area of Charles County. And it's a great native plant outlet. And they also have a lot of plant giveaways. Well, I want to thank you all so much for joining, especially on the short notice we had of this presentation with Scott's problems with the hurricane. And check back on our website. We have a monthly program every month, the first Wednesday night of every month at 7 o'clock on all sorts of nature issues. So we welcome you to come anytime. And thanks so much for being here tonight.